Have you ever wanted to learn English but didn't know where to start? Maybe you've tried before but felt confused or frustrated. Don't worry, you are not alone. Today, I will tell you the story of Raina, a girl who wanted to learn English but had no idea how to begin. But when she found the right way, everything changed. Welcome to English Tone, where we teach English through stories. If you're looking for simple and fun ways to learn English, you're in the right place. In today's story, you will see how Raina discovered the best way to start learning English. Stay with us until the end. Raina had always been fascinated by the English language. Whenever she watched movies, she admired how effortlessly the actors spoke. She saw people in her town confidently speaking English with foreigners, and she wished she could do the same. Her biggest dream was to study abroad one day, but she knew she had to learn English first. She imagined herself walking into a classroom in another country, introducing herself fluently and making new friends easily. She wanted to speak without fear, without hesitation. But every time she tried, she felt lost and overwhelmed. Determined to learn, Reina decided to start with books. One evening, she went to the bookstore and picked up an English novel. The cover was colorful, and she felt excited. This will help me learn, she thought. She opened the first page and started reading. Within seconds, her excitement turned into confusion. The sentences were long, and there were so many difficult words she didn't understand. What does exaggerate mean? She wondered. She checked the dictionary, but the meaning still didn't make sense. She pushed herself to keep reading, but after 10 minutes, her head hurt. She felt tired and frustrated. "This is too hard," she whispered. She closed the book and sighed. Maybe reading wasn't the right way to start. Raina thought, maybe I just need to learn more words first. So, the next day, she wrote down 20 English words and their meanings in her notebook. She repeated them over and over again. Appreciate means, what was it again? She mumbled, trying to recall the meaning. No matter how many times she repeated the words, they wouldn't stay in her memory. By the next day, she had forgotten most of them. She became frustrated and annoyed. How could other people learn English so easily when she was struggling so much? One morning, while walking to school, Raina saw a group of tourists asking for directions. She heard them speaking in English and understood some words, but not enough to help them. Still, she wanted to try. She stepped forward and nervously said, you go, straight and, left, and then, She struggled to find the right words. The tourists waited patiently, but she could see the confusion on their faces. Finally, one of them said, "It's okay. Thank you," and walked away. Raina's face turned red with embarrassment. She felt ashamed and useless. She walked home in silence, feeling like a failure. At school, Raina's English teacher asked a question. She knew the answer in her mind, but her tongue felt heavy. "Raina, can you answer?" the teacher asked. She stood up slowly. Everyone in the class stared at her. She opened her mouth, but the words came out wrong and broken. Her classmates giggled. Some whispered, "She doesn't know how to speak." Raina's heart sank. She quickly sat down and looked at her desk, wishing she could disappear. After that day, she stopped trying to speak in class. She was too afraid of making mistakes. One night, Raina sat by her window, staring at the stars. Maybe English isn't for me, she thought. Maybe I'll never learn. Maybe I'm just not smart enough. She remembered all the times she had tried. Reading didn't work. Memorizing words didn't work. Speaking made her nervous. She felt defeated. She wanted to give up. Just as she was about to close her notebook forever, she heard a voice. It was her younger sister, Amina, watching an English cartoon on TV. Raina listened carefully. The sentences were short and simple. The characters spoke slowly and clearly. And then, something amazing happened. She understood some words. Not all of them. Not perfectly, but enough. She suddenly had a thought. What if I don't start with books or grammar? What if I start by just listening? For the first time in a long while, she felt a spark of hope. She didn't know if this method would work, but she was willing to try. With a new sense of determination, she got up and went to find her old teacher, Mrs. Helen, to ask for advice. The day was warm, and the afternoon sun cast golden light over the quiet streets as Raina walked toward her old school. She had spent many years here, but today she wasn't coming as a student. She was coming as a seeker of answers. Her mind was full of doubts and questions. Why is English so difficult? Why does it feel like I can never learn? What am I doing wrong? She needed guidance. She needed someone who understood her struggle. And so, she found herself standing at the door of a small, cozy classroom where an elderly woman sat at her desk, flipping through an old book. Mrs. Helen, her former English teacher. Mrs. Helen looked up and smiled. Raina, it's been a while. What brings you here? Raina hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath. Mrs. Helen, I want to learn English, but I don't know where to start. Mrs. Helen's eyes twinkled with kindness. She gestured for Raina to sit down. Tell me, she said, what have you tried so far? Raina sighed. I tried reading books, but the words were too hard. I tried memorizing vocabulary, but I forgot them quickly. And when I tried speaking, I made mistakes and people laughed. She lowered her gaze. I feel like I'll never learn. Mrs. Helen nodded thoughtfully. Raina, let me ask you something. She leaned forward with a gentle smile. When a baby learns to speak, do they start with grammar books? Raina blinked in surprise. Then she laughed. No, they listen first, then they try to speak. That's exactly how you should learn English, said Mrs. Helen. Start with listening. Listen to simple English every day. Then, try to copy what you hear. Don't worry about mistakes. Just start. Raina sat in silence, thinking about Mrs. Helen's words. She had always believed that learning English had to start with books, grammar rules, and memorization. But now, Mrs. Helen was telling her something completely different. She thought back to her little cousin, Amina. Amina was just 3 years old, yet she spoke their native language fluently. How? Because she had been listening since the day she was born. Could it really be that simple? Mrs. Helen saw the doubt on Raina's face and smiled. I can see you're still unsure. Let me show you something. She reached into her drawer and pulled out an old tape recorder. She pressed play, and a voice filled the room. Hello, my name is Anna. I love reading books. What do you like to do? The voice was clear, slow, and easy to understand. Mrs. Helen stopped the tape and looked at Raina. Did you understand that? Raina nodded. Yes. She said her name is Anna, and she likes reading. See, Mrs. Helen said, you just learned something new by listening. Imagine if you listened to English like this every day. Little by little, your brain would start picking up words and sentences naturally. Raina's eyes widened. So, I don't need to start with difficult books? No, Mrs. Helen said firmly. Start small. Listen to children's cartoons, simple English conversations, and beginner-friendly podcasts. At first, you might not understand everything, but over time, your ears will get used to the sounds of English. Raina still had one concern. But what about speaking? I get nervous. I'm afraid I'll make mistakes and people will laugh at me again. Mrs. Helen chuckled. Raina, tell me, when a baby says their first words, do they speak perfectly? Raina shook her head. No, they make mistakes. Exactly, said Mrs. Helen. And what do their parents do? Do they laugh at them? Raina thought for a moment. No, they smile and encourage them to try again. Mrs. Helen nodded. That's how you need to treat yourself. Making mistakes is part of learning. The more you try, the more confident you'll become. She reached for a small whiteboard and wrote a sentence. Practice makes perfect, but I don't feel confident, Raina admitted. Confidence comes from doing, Mrs. Helen said. Don't wait to feel ready. Just start. A simple plan to start learning English. Mrs. Helen could see that Raina was still unsure, so she decided to give her a simple plan. 1. Listen to English for 10 minutes every day. Cartoons, podcasts, or simple conversations. 2. Repeat what she hears, even if she doesn't understand everything. 3. Speak a little every day, even if it's just a few words. 4. Forget about being perfect. Mistakes are okay. Raina took out her notebook and wrote it all down. For how long should I do this? She asked. Mrs. Helen smiled. Do it for a month, and you'll see a difference. Do it for 6 months, and you'll surprise yourself. Do it for a year, and you'll be speaking confidently. Raina felt a spark of motivation. For the first time, she had a clear path. That evening, Raina went home feeling excited. She searched for English listening for beginners on her phone. She found a video of a simple English conversation and pressed play. Hi, how are you? A voice said. Raina listened carefully. Then, she paused the video and repeated the sentence. Hi, how are you? She said, copying the voice. She did this again and again. At first, she felt silly, but after a few minutes, it became fun. She was learning without stress. She kept repeating the sentences, feeling more comfortable each time. She smiled. Maybe this can work after all. Little did she know, this was the beginning of a new journey, a journey where she would finally learn to speak English. The next morning, Raina woke up with a new mindset. She had always dreamed of speaking English fluently, but until now, she never knew how to start. Mrs. Helen's words kept echoing in her mind. Listen first, then try to copy what you hear. She took a deep breath and promised herself, no more overthinking, no more fear. Today I begin. But there was one problem. Raina didn't know what to listen to. English felt difficult. The people on TV spoke too fast. English songs had words she didn't understand. But she reminded herself, I don't have to understand everything. I just have to listen. Instead of opening a grammar book or try to memorize difficult words, Raina decided to start simple. She searched online for easy English podcasts and found one meant for beginners. The host spoke slowly and used simple words. At first, the words sounded unfamiliar. It was like hearing a new language for the first time. But she didn't stop. She put in her headphones and started listening while making her bed. She didn't pause. She didn't rewind. She just let the words flow into her ears. She continued listening while brushing her hair. Then while eating breakfast, she wasn't studying. She was just surrounding herself with English. That day, she listened for 1 hour. She didn't understand everything, but something strange happened. Some words sounded familiar. A sentence here, a phrase there. It felt like her brain was waking up to a new rhythm. Maybe this is working, she thought. Later that evening, Raina decided to try something new. She remembered how she had learned her native language as a child, through cartoons. So, she searched for an English cartoon for kids and found one with simple dialogues. At first, she just watched. She noticed how characters greeted each other. Hello, how are you? I'm fine, thank you. She repeated these lines softly to herself. The next morning, she said them out loud in front of the mirror. It felt silly, but she kept going. Every day, she watched an episode and copied the sentences. Good morning. What's your name? I am Raina. Nice to meet you. She wasn't just watching cartoons anymore. She was practicing. After a week, something amazing happened. She was listening to her usual podcast when she suddenly recognized a word. Morning. She smiled. She had heard that word before. Then another. Friend. And another. Thank you. She didn't know all the words, but she wasn't lost anymore. Some words stood out, like tiny lights in the darkness. This is working, she whispered. A few days later, she was watching her favorite cartoon when she heard a full sentence that she understood. I am happy today. Raina gasped. I know what that means. For the first time, English didn't feel like a foreign language. It felt familiar. By now, listening had become a part of her daily routine. She didn't force herself to study. She just surrounded herself with English. She listened to a podcast while walking to school. She watched an English cartoon before bed. She repeated small phrases she heard. She hummed English songs, even if she didn't understand all the words. English was no longer a subject. It was a part of her life. But she still had one problem. She was only listening. She wasn't speaking much. One evening, as she watched her favorite cartoon, she had an idea. What if I speak along with them? The next day, she played the cartoon again. But this time, she paused after every line and repeated it out loud. "Good morning," she said, copying the character's tone. "I am happy today," she repeated, mimicking the way it sounded. She kept going. Every day, she copied and repeated what she heard. And slowly, something amazing happened. Her mouth got used to English. Her ears started recognizing words. Her brain started understanding meanings. She didn't know all the rules of English, but it didn't matter. She was learning. One day, while she was sitting with her younger cousin, the little girl asked, "Sister, how do I say thank you in English?" Without thinking, Raina replied, "You say thank you." Her cousin smiled, but Raina froze. She had just spoken English without thinking. Not because she memorized it, not because she studied a grammar book, but because she had listened so much that English was now inside her mind. That night, she lay in bed, smiling. This is working. But deep inside, she knew she had only taken the first step. I can understand English now, she thought, but I still need to practice speaking more. She had built her foundation. Now it was time for the next step, daily speaking practice. And so, her real challenge began. Raina made a promise to herself. I will practice a little every day. This simple decision marked the beginning of a new chapter in her journey to learn English. She realized that success wasn't about learning everything all at once, but about taking small steps every day. At first, Raina wasn't sure how effective this daily practice would be. She often felt frustrated because she wasn't seeing big changes right away. But every time she spoke in English or wrote a sentence, it felt like she was doing something important. It felt like she was moving closer to her goal. She didn't expect to be perfect, but she did expect progress, and she kept that promise to herself. Raina started by speaking English whenever she could. One of the first things she did was practice speaking in front of the mirror. This was something Mrs. Helen had suggested, speaking to yourself. Raina thought it was a little strange at first, but she gave it a try. Every morning, she stood in front of the mirror, looked at her reflection, and spoke in English. At first, it was difficult. Her sentences were simple. She would say, "Good morning. My name is Raina. I am learning English. I will go to school today." It felt awkward. She didn't understand everything she said, and sometimes she made mistakes. But as she continued to practice every day, something began to change. Her sentences started sounding more natural. Her confidence grew. She even noticed something amazing. She didn't feel embarrassed anymore. At first, speaking English felt like a big challenge, but after a few weeks of looking at herself and speaking confidently, Raina started to smile when she spoke. This is not so bad, she thought. Maybe I'm getting better after all. Next, Raina made a habit of describing her day in English. She would do this while getting ready in the morning or before bed. Sometimes, she would even write her thoughts in her journal. "Today was a good day," she would write. "I woke up early, had breakfast, and then went to school." The next day, her sentences became longer. "I met my friend Sarah at school. We studied together for the math test. After school, we played soccer in the park." Sometimes, she found it hard to describe everything exactly the way she wanted. Her mind would try to form the sentences in her native language first, but then she would struggle to translate them into English. But instead of getting frustrated, Raina would take a deep breath, remind herself that it was okay to make mistakes, and continue practicing. She also started listening carefully to how people spoke English around her, whether it was her teacher, her friends, or even strangers on the bus. She noticed the simple phrases they used every day, like, "How are you?" and "What's for lunch today?" She started using those phrases in her daily conversations. "Hi, how are you today?" she would say to her friends. They would smile and answer, and sometimes they even asked her back, "How are you?" That made her feel good. Even though Raina wasn't perfect, she didn't mind. She realized that perfection wasn't the goal. The goal was communication, and every time she spoke or wrote, she was closer to achieving that. Each day, Raina became more comfortable in using English as part of her life. But speaking wasn't the only thing Raina focused on. She also learned the importance of listening. She found that listening to English every day helped her pick up new words, phrases, and even different accents. In the beginning, Raina could only understand a little bit of what she heard. Sometimes, she had to replay a podcast several times before she could understand what the speaker was saying. But slowly, it started to make sense. She didn't need to understand every word, she realized. The key was understanding the meaning. She started listening to English podcasts during her morning walks and whenever she was doing chores at home. She enjoyed listening to simple English stories, which helped her hear the way sentences were naturally structured. At the same time, Raina would repeat what she heard. "What's your name?" she would say after hearing the podcast. "My name is Raina," she would answer back. This simple practice, done every day, had a huge impact. Listening helped her hear how English was spoken and allowed her to copy the rhythm and intonation. It was like learning to play a new instrument. At first, it was difficult to make the correct sounds, but after hours of practice, everything started to flow. Raina also focused on writing. Every night before bed, she took out her notebook and wrote down some sentences in English. The sentences were simple at first, things like, "I am happy today," or "I like to read books." As she got better, she started writing more complicated thoughts. Sometimes, she wrote about her family, her friends, or the things she wanted to do in the future. One day, "I want to travel to England," she wrote. "I want to speak with people there in English." In the beginning, Raina worried a lot about making mistakes. She would erase her sentences and try to rewrite them perfectly. But soon, she realized that this wasn't helping her. The important part was getting her thoughts down, not worrying about mistakes. She stopped erasing everything and began writing freely. When she made a mistake, she didn't panic. She just corrected it and moved on. And guess what? After 1 month, she felt more confident. She wasn't perfect, but she was better. She could speak in full sentences without feeling afraid. She could write small paragraphs in English without hesitation. And most importantly, she was enjoying the process. Learning English was no longer a burden. It was part of her daily life. Raina had made incredible progress, but she knew there was still so much more to learn. Every day, she thought about how far she had come, but she also thought about how much farther she could go. The more she practiced, the more she realized that learning English wasn't about being perfect. It was about trying every day and improving little by little. "I can do this," she thought. "I just need to keep going." And then, one day, while walking through the park, she met Mrs. Helen again. The wise teacher smiled warmly and asked, "How are you doing with your English?" Raina felt proud as she answered, "I'm better. I speak more confidently now, and I can write and understand more. It feels great." Mrs. Helen nodded and said, "That's wonderful, Raina. Keep practicing every day, and don't be afraid to make mistakes. You're doing exactly what you need to do. And remember, it's not about being perfect. It's about starting and staying consistent." Raina smiled and thought about how far she had come and how much more she could achieve. She was on the right path, and she would never stop learning. One day, Raina met Mrs. Helen again after weeks of practicing her English. Her excitement was bubbling over as she approached her teacher. With a bright smile and a voice full of joy, she exclaimed, "Teacher, your advice worked. I can speak better now." Mrs. Helen's face lit up with a knowing smile, as if she had been waiting for this moment. She had seen the transformation happening all along, even when Raina couldn't quite see it herself. Mrs. Helen nodded thoughtfully. "I knew it would, Raina. But do you know why it worked?" Raina looked at her teacher with curiosity, eager to hear the explanation behind her success. "It's because you did one simple thing. You started. You didn't wait for the perfect time or the perfect situation. You just started. Many people think they need to have everything figured out before they begin, but that's a mistake. The secret is simple. Just start." Raina felt a wave of realization wash over her. She had often thought that she needed to learn everything perfectly before speaking, or that she should wait until she understood all the grammar rules before starting to speak. But now, looking back at her progress, she understood that the act of starting, even when it was uncomfortable or imperfect, was the key to her success. "But what if I make mistakes?" Raina asked, a bit worried. She still had moments of hesitation, especially when speaking with others in English. She knew that perfection was impossible, but the thought of making mistakes in front of others still made her anxious. Mrs. Helen smiled gently. "Raina, mistakes are a part of the process. No one learns anything new without making mistakes. Do you remember when you were a little girl learning to walk? You fell down many times, didn't you?" Raina nodded, her face lighting up with the memory of her childhood. "Yes, I fell a lot, and sometimes it hurt, but I kept getting up." "Exactly," Mrs. Helen said with enthusiasm. "The same thing applies to learning English. Just like when you were learning to walk, you didn't wait for the perfect moment or for someone to tell you everything about walking before you tried it. You just got up, took a step, fell, and then tried again. The more you practiced, the better you became." Raina thought about how she had learned to walk and talk when she was younger. At the time, she hadn't been afraid to fail. She had taken those steps over and over again until they became easier, and soon enough, she was walking with confidence. She realized that the same principle applied to learning English. "Just start," Mrs. Helen repeated. "It's all about consistency. Every day, you take one small step, and before you know it, those little steps add up to great progress." Raina nodded thoughtfully. "So, it's not about waiting for the right moment or trying to be perfect. It's about just starting and sticking with it every day." Mrs. Helen smiled warmly. "That's right. The key is consistency. Some days will be harder than others, but that's okay. Every step you take, every sentence you speak, every word you listen to, every mistake you make is part of the learning process. And remember, it's not just about speaking English perfectly. It's about communicating. It's about making the effort, even when it feels difficult. It's about enjoying the process of learning and growing." Raina sat quietly, reflecting on what her teacher had said. She now understood that learning English wasn't about achieving perfection. It wasn't about waiting until everything was in place. It was about consistency, doing a little bit every day, staying committed, and most importantly, enjoying the journey. She thought about the days when she first started, how hard it seemed. The vocabulary felt overwhelming, the grammar confusing, and the fear of making mistakes was always there. But now, she could see how far she had come. She could speak simple sentences, understand more when people spoke to her, and even hold short conversations with others in English. She still had a long way to go, but she was proud of how far she had come. "Thank you, Mrs. Helen," Raina said with gratitude. "I think I understand now. It's not about waiting for everything to be perfect. It's about starting and not giving up. It's about consistency." Mrs. Helen nodded, her eyes filled with encouragement. "Exactly. And remember, Raina, There will always be new things to learn, and there will always be challenges along the way. But don't worry about the challenges. Embrace them. With every challenge, you'll grow stronger, more confident, and more fluent. Raina felt a deep sense of peace. She had found the key to her success, and it wasn't a secret formula or some magical method. It was something simple: consistency. By just starting, she had unlocked her potential. She had started the journey of learning, and now there was no turning back. As Raina walked away from Mrs. Helen that day, she felt empowered. She had a plan: listen every day, speak every day, and practice every day. She knew there would be times when she would feel frustrated or when she would make mistakes. But now, she also knew that those moments were part of the journey. She didn't need to be perfect. She just needed to keep going. If you're watching Raina's story and thinking about how you can start your own English learning journey, take her lesson to heart. It's never too late to begin. The best time to start learning English is right now. So, pick something simple. Listen to an English podcast, watch an English video, or repeat a few sentences you hear. Don't worry about being perfect. Just start. Speak, listen, practice, and enjoy the process. As Raina learned, the key to mastering anything, whether it's English, a new skill, or a new hobby, is the willingness to begin and the consistency to keep going, no matter how small the steps may seem. So, to everyone watching this video, remember, you don't have to wait for the right time. You don't need to be perfect. You just need to start. And with consistency, you will grow and succeed. Did you like Raina's story? Now, tell us, how did you start learning English? Comment below. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to English Tone for more amazing stories. See you in the next video.